Welcome to this session organised by the RSS International Development Section. I'm Phil Crook, Meeting Secretary of the section. In 2015, the United Nations launched the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, a comprehensive programme towards a better world for all. Associated with the agenda are 17 all-embracing and interlocked goals, with 168 targets and currently 231 indicators. Though statisticians were involved with the agenda from the outset, unlike the case of Millennium Development Goals, the SDGs present us with challenges. Some of the targets we were asked to measure were not then being measured, and in some cases, there was not even agreed methodology by which to measure them. Over the last 5 years, great strides have been made with methods, sources, coverage, and so on, but more challenges remain, not least those of data disaggregation across multiple dimensions, so that we leave no one behind. Our 4 speakers this afternoon will examine the SDG process from various viewpoints. Johannes Jütting, Executive Head of Paris 21, will start by asking the crucial question, the SDGs, friend or foe of statisticians? Fiona Dawe, Head of SDGs for the UK Office for National Statistics, will describe the current status of UK reporting, and in particular, disaggregation. She'll also tell us about the open access SDG reporting platform, which the ONS has developed. Leake, Head of Education and Public Services for the Welsh Government, will describe how Wales developed its own sustainable development agenda, building on the SDGs, but very much a national product. Finally, Powell will tell us about what's happening in Myanmar, where he's been working as a UNDP consultant. After the presentations, the speakers will be glad to answer your questions in the time remaining, and you can post these questions in the chat column. I welcome all 4 speakers on your behalf. Johannes, over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Phil. Hello, everybody. It's nice to be part of this exciting event. I greet you here. I'm sitting in close to Paris for once in the office, just for one day. But otherwise, as many of us do, home office. I'm very excited to speak about the topic of SDGs and taking a little bit of a step back. Are they a friend or foe for statisticians and data? What I will do in the 12 to 15 minutes I have is make 3 points and then conclude. So the first point is making the case that the Agenda 2030 is a chance for statistics, definitely, and has been leading to many interesting conversations. And Phil has already mentioned a couple of them. Then I will go more into the challenges and develop a few challenges that have come across, in particular for poor countries. The perspective I want to take from Paris 21 is through the lens for particular poor, vulnerable, low capacity countries. And then I want to basically, at the end, some sort of bringing the pros and cons through the lens of COVID-19. I think COVID-19 is an amplifier for some of the things we have been seeing, and want to say a few things about this before I conclude. So to start with, the Agenda 2030, the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, I think overall they have, if we recall the conversation in 2015, there was a lot of excitement. And I think it's fair to say that through the SDGs, the topic of data and statistics has been surfing to the top of the agenda of many people who haven't thought about data and statistics before. Some of you have been involved maybe in the Millennium Development Goals, and you recall data and statistics in the MDGs, they were literally an afterthought. And in drumming up the and in developing the SDGs with the indicators, with the targets, we have seen that the policymakers were from the beginning interested in discussing also how we can actually measure the success and evaluate the success of the policies that are hopefully leading to the SDGs. So there was from the beginning an interest in stock taking, but also in tracking progress. And data and statistics has been seen as one important element in helping us to assess progress. So the increased awareness of data-driven policy making and statistics with knock-on effects in areas such as financial integration, well-being, and environmental policy was very obvious. A second point here, also topics, I think, Phil, you mentioned, is that in the aftermath, when we started to dig a little bit deeper, the topic of leave no one behind has given lots of interest in disaggregation, looking for vulnerable people. And I think very interesting debates also in our community about how can we measure vulnerable groups, how can we find them? For instance, are also new technologies, big data, is this helpful? Are there risks to it? So I think there have been some very, very important debates starting, driven by the SDG agenda, elderly statistics. Yesterday I was taking part in a conversation about internally displaced people, refugee statistics. All these things have sort of surfaced and have also inspired methodological conversations within our community and beyond. So I think that's the second point next to data is back, that we have a couple of interesting things here that wasn't there before. The examples, I mean, in a country example that comes to mind, which I have been working on a lot in myself, is Philippines. Philippines and SDGs is a wonderful example of how a country took the SDGs framework very seriously. They had their national plans. They were looking into their national plans indicators, were mapping them to the international goal framework. And I think they did it in a very smart way. And so I think for me, Philippines is a good example of how the SDGs could also help national policy making. The last point I wanted to make here on the set of friend side of things is funding. At least, I mean, the conversation of funding has started. Let me put it this way. We all hope that there would be more money coming. I mean, the statistical community has delivered. I mean, we have this international data framework. We have a plan, the Cape Town Action Plan. We have numbers. We know roughly it costs 5.6 billion a year through 2030 for 144 countries. And it's just missing the money. I mean, if you look at the numbers that we are monitoring at Paris 21, the so-called press report, you will be seeing that it's hovering around 600 to 700 million a year of order to support to data and statistics, which is roughly speaking about 0.5%, 0.4% of official development aid. Unfortunately, that hasn't changed that much. So while the SDGs and data and statistics are more on the agenda, it hasn't necessarily overall led to a more funding for our agenda. The slight sort of clarification or qualification I want to make here is that for some aspects of data and statistics, agriculture statistics and also gender statistics, we have seen a significant increase. So, but overall, I would say from that perspective, the 2000 agenda with the leave no one behind has been a good thing. Now, on the other side, coming to the challenges, there are a couple of key challenges I think that will be coming up also in later on. Maybe Matthew will also speak about them. I think the key challenge is that there is a sort of spat and there's a conflict between the international monitoring or the monitoring of international goals, the SDGs, versus data produced for national policy making. So what does that mean? Most of the countries, they have national policy frameworks, they have national plans, and they have national statistical plans, the NSDSs. And those were already written. And now the SDGs came and have put on top of those plans another international goal framework, which was not in all cases aligned with national goals and the national context, which has then led to a completely crowding out and overburden of already under-resourced statistical systems, in particular in poor and vulnerable countries. So I think the OECD countries, I have seen them, they were quite well placed to say, hey, we do it our way. This is our way how we do it. And Maybe international organizations like OECD and EU were also providing the data. But for poor countries, because also of an incentive maybe to produce those data, because there was money attached to it, then they have shifted eventually resources to some areas and some data production that wasn't necessarily in line with their own problems in their specific countries. Speak specifically, I have the example of Pacific Islands, the SEATS countries, where you can see that there is a bit of an opportunistic, sometimes crowding in of funds in certain areas and sometimes of a crowding out. So that's certainly a problem between the international and the national. And then, as you can understand, the policy coherence within countries. It has also led for lots of challenges within countries to coordinate. There is an SDG sort of planning ministry, but then the National Statistical Office was not always engaged into this conversation. I happened to participate in the voluntary national reviews of countries in New York. Quite interesting. Data was always the first point. The countries were trying to show where they stand, but they didn't have the data. So in that sense, again, it was good that policymakers from countries saw that the data is not there, but yet national statistical offices were often left out of the conversation. They weren't part of the VNRs. And I think that's something we definitely need to change. So there is a lot of issues about the policy coherence in countries between different ministries, between the NSO, the whole national statistical systems, and the coordination and capacitating national statistical systems is a challenge which we need to take on more seriously. And the last point here I want to make is, and this is really a tricky one, which leads to lots of problems. And that is the coordination and alignment challenge. Now I'm talking between shared results frameworks, between 8 agencies, let's say the DFIDs, the German BMZ, the AFDs of this world, and their legitimate need to show results. So they have their results framework that are based on theory of change, on outputs, outcomes, indicators, activities. You all know this. Yet, and that needs to be attributed to their action. But you can imagine how complicated this is if you have an overlay of SDGs. How will you do that? And so on the one hand, we have 2 to 3% of ODA being currently invested in monitoring and evaluation, while only 0.3% on data and statistics. There's a completely mismatch. And unfortunately, we haven't yet brought together the 8 results M&E people with the statistical people who would like to strengthen statistical systems, who would ideally produce the data that they could use. So this whole shared results framework is something that I would like to see we look into for the next 15 years. The good news is we still have 15 years. I mean, we still can we have still 10 years, but it's a decade of action, not 15 years, 10 years only, but still we have a bit of time to change. Now, let me come to the third and last point. Phil, I'm conscious about time. Seems to be good. So after sort of looking at the positive things and negative things, I thought I look a little bit at COVID and what COVID changes. I mean, overall speaking, COVID-19, the pandemic, is it good or bad for data and statistics? That's also an interesting question to ask. On the one hand, again, I think it has contributed to all over the world to a raise again of awareness of data and statistics. We have even discussed, at evening tables about mortality rates and infection rates and what does it all mean. I think everybody has become a little data expert to some extent, or wanted to become eventually. So that was quite good. On the other hand, the more people realized, hey, there are so many different data out there, and the one professor said this and the other professor was this, there was also over time an increasing confusion. And people were literally getting angry and say, hey, how can the professor one from Harvard say infection rates go up, while the other professor says they go down or are not so important, and they were quarreling about different measures. So at the same time, the issue about the quality of data came up. And here, that again, I think is a huge opportunity, which I think the official national statistical offices need to step in much more to argue for quality data and for systemic data to drive policy decisions. It's not easy because everybody wants to have the granular and quick data, but I think it's something very much in line with the SDGs that needs to be discussed. It's very clear that the COVID-19 currently leads to a reprioritization of SDGs, which will again have an impact on data and statistical production. Many aid agencies currently are reprogramming their aid towards social protection policies, labor market policies, health, of course. And so there will be lots of knock-on effects on measurements, which again needs to be taken into account. From the perspective of development cooperation, we need more a strengthening of systems. We have seen that in the time of COVID, statistical offices, the surveys were no longer possible. And we could see that countries with strong administrative systems fared far better in mobilizing quick response and were more resilient than countries not. So the whole case about investing in system has been made again. Currently, unfortunately, DAC members, the Development Assistance Committee members, support more statistical capacity development through household service and census than investing in administrative systems. So again, something we need to change. I think the overall bigger question, so there's one is on for the aid agencies that I think I have made the point very clear.
Couple of minutes, Johannes, please.
Yeah, I come to the sort of close to the concluding. So on the COVID point and SDGs, so I think clearly the case for more strengthening system is even more, it has been an amplifier for the argument. So what everybody is calling now for more health data, we need a strengthening of systems, that's for sure. And aid agencies need to support this. On the other hand, I think for our community, the official statistical community, they have to also step up. I mean, the data, NSOs as data stewardship is very important. There are a couple of interesting examples. Colombia, for example, has been, they have been joining advisory panels in national governments. The Colombian Statistical Office joined a task force to advise the government on how to use census and health data to design their COVID-19 response. So that you could also see a very sort of different responses from different NSOs. In that sense, I mean, the old classical thing, what Paris 21 would always argue for are the NSDS, the national plans. Again, that would be also something to not to forget, and also in line with the COVID response to not forget about these national statistical plans. So where does it leave it all in terms of concluding? What needs to be done next? So the first thing, I mean, in conclusion is, of course, friend or foe, it's in the middle. I think the glass is, I would say, half full. So I think the SDGs are a great agenda overall. And I think from our perspective, there's still, as I said, there's still a decade of action. We can still correct some of the things that weren't going so well in the first 15 years. So there is something to be done. The strengthening the case of systems I've been making. And then I would like to close a little bit, I mean, is with this funding exercise. And just to sort of say that it's time. I mean, we have the World Data Forum coming up, the UN World Data Forum. It will be a virtual one in Bern. And there is a group that has been it's the Bern Network on Financing More and Better Development Data that has been created. First time donor agencies and statistical offices have teamed up to make a plan and also to help spend the money better. It's not only about more, it's about domestic resource mobilization, it's about better spending. And there is an idea about to develop a clearinghouse. It's like a platform where both donors and recipients could go and find better information and make better decisions. So I invite you all to look up the Bern Network, to look up the clearinghouse, and eventually to support us in this endeavor. And there is an event on the 21st of October, a virtual event. I invite you all to join by the Bern Network. It's again a virtual event to be part of it. So with this, Phil, I hope I have given you some ideas about what I think about SDGs, data and statistics. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Johannes, for the, well, very thought-provoking reflections to start us off. So without further ado, I'll now pass over to Fiona Dawe from the ONS.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to speak today. So I'm the head of the Sustainable Development Goals team at the Office for National Statistics, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about how we want to be moving away from or moving beyond the headline reporting to achieve sustainability. Johannes has given us a lot to think about in terms of the effectiveness of the SDGs, and I'm focusing purely on the reporting that we're doing in the UK and how we're trying to help internationally as well. The UK government at the SDG high-level political forum at the UN in July talked about the SDGs as being pivotal in terms of the country's response to build back better from COVID-19. And I'm going to touch on some of the work we've been doing at ONS in response to COVID-19 and our reporting and how that's influenced the way that we are going to be looking moving forward. Can I have my next slide, please? Thank you. So the data that we reporting for the UK is headline data mainly. So we report 78% of all 244 indicators currently on our platform. And this diagram here shows each of those 17 goals, and where it's full up, it means that we have achieved headline data for all the indicators. The work is still ongoing to source data for the remaining indicators and to further disaggregate already reported indicators. Most of the data that we report is official data, so it's government data. It aligns to the UK Stats Authority Code of Practice. However, what I do want to make clear is that all the data that we report, we're actually recycling, so it's been collected for other purposes, and then we have are using it to report for the SDGs as well. And where possible, we make sure that it aligns as closely to the UN metadata as it can. Okay, can I have my next slide, please? So we're not just reporting headline data. We, in July 2018, we signed up with what was the Department of International Development and now the Foreign Commonwealth Development Office, signed up to the Inclusive Data Charter. And so we're committed to disaggregate and break down data to identify which groups are most vulnerable and therefore in danger of being left behind. And I think the graph on this slide really shows the reason why. So the middle line is the total, the headline figure. So if we just had that headline figure, we would say that suicide mortality rate is about 10% for the UK to slightly above. And it's when you then disaggregate, you break it down and you really see who are the most vulnerable. And you can see there, this is just being broken down by sex. And you can see that the picture for men and women is very different. And it really shows the strength of needing to look beneath and beyond the headline figure to really understand. So our next step is now to start focusing much more on trying to increase the amount of disaggregated data that we're reporting for the UK. We are in the position that 134 of the indicators on our platform have at least one disaggregation, but obviously we need to do far more than that. And on the slide, you can see the 8 Inclusive Data Charter characteristics that we have committed to disaggregating our data by, as well as anything else that may be relevant. So for example, indicator 2.2.2, which is the prevalence of malnutrition, we break that one down by BMI because obviously that is a very relevant indicator to understand who is most vulnerable. But sourcing data that facilitates disaggregation is really difficult. In order to be able to use survey samples, which most of our data is drawn from, you would need enormous, large sample sizes so that not only can you create robust statistics at each of those 8 different subgroups, but you really ideally want to look within those subgroups. So you want to look at age, by sex, by ethnicity, etc. And in order to be able to do that and do it in robustness, we need to have huge data sources, which is where we're really struggling. So we want to start looking at how we can utilize a much broader range of data sources beyond official data, but we want to do so with a quality assurance framework around it. So we're in the process of developing a protocol to guide the use of data from a variety of sources. innovative sources, academic, qualitative, citizen-generated, etc. And our aim is to identify data that can either provide a source to report UK progress, so we could use it on our data site, or to provide insight where that data isn't sufficient to report at the UK level. So, for example, there might be some academic work being done on food banks, for example, but it's very much qualitative data at a local area. But what it is giving is really rich insight into the particular groups that are the most vulnerable. But we want to have that assurance that the data that we are using may not have been collected and collated under the UK SA Code of Practice, but with our protocol, it aligns and gives us that same kind of assurance. We're also working to identify new innovative data solutions. We work quite closely with our colleagues in the National Statistics Data Science Campus. And in particular, at the moment, they're looking at how we can use satellite and mapping data to be able to provide information about the change in extent of water-related ecosystems over time. And whilst most of the work we do with them is primarily how can we provide a new data source for the UK, we're always thinking about how we can then share that internationally. So there's actually two projects there. One is looking at UK ecosystems, but we're also doing another sub-project with the UN Environment Programme, where we are looking at how the methodology will be able to be used in other areas of the world, such as Kenya, and making sure that it's all aligned. We're also talking to academics and organisations that are active in the topic areas where we have data or disaggregation gaps, to try and work together to source new data and provide the insight. So, for example, we've been talking to Manchester University and Climate Just, looking at the impact of climate change on society, and they're particularly interested in the impact of flooding on different social groups. Can we move over to the next slide, please? So we're using different methods across ONS to fill disaggregation gaps, and COVID-19 has given us impetus to find new methods and to accelerate the need, particularly for inclusive data. And as this slide shows, it's just a selection of some of the data that's come out of ONS. So ONS has been disaggregating COVID-19 data by multiple factors to try and inform what is happening and who is the most vulnerable. So, for example, they've disaggregated by ethnicity, sex, age, occupation and religion, etc., highlighting people who are more at risk from COVID-19, for example, people from deprived backgrounds, the BAME community, people who are older and males. So as an office, we are providing a rapid response and timely indicators to measure the effects of COVID-19. New experimental data and indices are included as and when new data become available, either on a standalone or regular basis as appropriate, and are compiled from a variety of sources. And this has really brought to everybody's attention the need to look beyond the headline figure and to explore the intersectionality. How do the themes that normally have been looked at in a siloed form, how do they link together? Who are the groups most at risk? Where are they? Who are they? And the SDGs do offer a framework to do this. And we're working with colleagues in the office, and the National Statistician has recently established, or is establishing, an inclusive data task force to investigate and identify where the focus should be going forward. And the SDGs and the ethos of leave no one behind is central to this new task force. And we're looking forward to the recommendations and how those will impact on the SDGs. Have the next slide, please. So the next slide will show our national reporting platform. Please do note that if you've used it before, we've changed the URL. We are now official.gov.uk. And the team are developing the software, open source software, for the national reporting platform in collaboration with the US government and the Centre for Open Data Enterprise. And the ethos behind the development of the website is to make it collaborative in line with the goals. So OpenSDG is reusable, open source, and can be adapted by anyone that wants to use it. It allows you to be able to display the data, to disaggregate the data. You can display it in charts, maps, etc. And the idea is that it's an accessible tool. I have the next slide, please. So this next slide just shows how how many countries and areas are using our Open SDG software. So 15 countries are either currently using or in the pipeline to use it. But also increasingly local areas are using it. Los Angeles were the first, and I'm delighted to announce that Bristol in the UK have also decided that they are going to use Open SDG for their local reporting, and my team is working very closely with them to support the creation of their data set. And so we're exploring with Bristol and others that are active in the local SDG communities how we can support and add value to their data reporting. So this will both help them at the local level, but will also increase and improve our ability, we hope, to report more geographically disaggregated data. So Goal 17 is Partnership for the Goals, and very much in the spirit of this, my team is working to support statistical capability building internationally through supporting countries to be able to build an open SDG reporting platform. And the level of support depends on the country and their needs. But we do an awful lot of support. For example, last year, Kyrgyzstan, we visited them twice to help them set up and establish their platform. As IDC champions, so Inclusive Data Charter champions, I have somebody in my team, and that is their role. And in that role, they promote the use of disaggregated data and build partnerships between countries and organisations to facilitate their statistical capability. And in fact, last week they were hosting a webinar that was encouraging countries to report more disability based data using the Washington group method, and taking part with the World Health Organization and the UN. And we also, as I've already mentioned, hope to share our innovative solutions, our methodology developments. We'll share our protocol on the use of non-official data internationally, so that it's being best practice is being used and spread everywhere to help other people in their quest to be able to report the goals as well. So I just thought I'd finish by sort of thinking about COVID-19 and how it's highlighted the need for data beyond the national headline figures to understand where there is inequality and to identify who and where is being left behind. And the SDGs provides the data and the analytical framework to shine a light on the groups being left behind, and hopefully will help society to build back better. Thank you, Phil.
Gosh, well, thank you very much, Fiona. Yes, that was extremely interesting. Yes, plenty to think about there. Anyway, we will not pause for questions, but we'll press on. So I'd now ask Leake from the Welsh Government to give her presentation.
So hopefully you can see the slides. Good afternoon, and Prynhawn from Wales this afternoon. I want to be able to talk to you a little bit about the history of how we have embedded sustainable development throughout the Welsh Government, and through the policy and the way in which the statisticians have actually supported some of that. Okay. This is just to show that Wales is a country of beautiful coastlines, beautiful countryside, and vibrant towns and cities. But how do we make sure that in what we're doing, we're preparing Wales that will actually maintain that in the future? So I want to talk to you about the role of statisticians in this groundbreaking legislation that was brought in within Wales, the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. It's from 2015, and how we came to that within Wales. The statistical work comprised development of national indicators for Wales and work to develop national milestones, a preparation of an annual wellbeing report for Wales, and the work to consider how that linked in with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So as one of the countries of the UK, we have a democratically elected parliament now, known as the Senedd, and we are able to make laws. And what happened in Wales is that there was a commitment early days right back in 1998, one of the first countries in the world to make sustainable development part of a legal obligation within Wales. And we followed that up with a sustainable development white paper. So you can see that this is not, this is embedded from quite a long time ago. And this is our short history, I guess. As we know that the UN Sustainable Development Goals were being developed, we were also talking to the people of Wales and the citizens of Wales through a national conversation in 2014. We launched this as the Wales we want by 2050. And we were encouraging people to actually think differently and to act collectively towards shared goals. And that was really important to identify through engagement with citizens about what really mattered to them, what was important to them, to their children and to their grandchildren. And so, that's the background setting of where we got to the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act in 2015. And we noted, and we use this a lot, but the UN Director for Sustainable Development in 2015 saying what Wales is doing today, the world will be doing tomorrow. And that has set us, and we've moved forward from that. But it set us up, and there's a sort of national picture here that has the monitoring of well-being as part of the work and the whole ethos of how we go forward within Wales. So there is something here about there's a whole framework that is in place in order to embed the discussions about wellbeing goals throughout public services in Wales. It starts with the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals. We have set on the back of the conversations 7 wellbeing goals for Wales. I'll talk a little more about them later. But we also have, as part of the framework, the need, it was written into the Act that there would be national indicators for Wales, that we would set national milestones. There is a public duty on 44 different public bodies across Wales. So that is local authorities, it's Welsh Government, it is major organisations such as Natural Resources Wales and a variety of other public bodies. And there are 5 ways of working, which we build through what we do within the Welsh Government, but also we ask others to build into their work as public bodies. So that's about integrating work towards goals. So you don't just think that I'm thinking about health, so I'm just thinking about health. You're actually thinking about other things that might impact on people's health and how the health of the population might impact on their ability to work and earn income, etc., etc. So all of that is part of the framework for the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, and there is a range of accountability measures that are also built into the framework. So this first one at the edge there is the citizens. How do we actually involve them in holding people accountable for measures and moving towards the goals? And then the Parliament, the Senedd Cymru has a role in it. There's an Audit Wales organisation which is auditing public bodies to ask them to demonstrate how they are building the Future Generations framework into their work. And there is also the appointment of a Future Generations Commissioner for Wales, that's Sophie Howe, and her role is to be the guardian of future generations. You might ask, what does that mean? It's about helping public bodies and those who make policy in Wales to be thinking about the long-term impact of the decisions that they are making. So here are the goals. There are 7. It's not 17 goals. It's deliberately designed to be a relatively small number. But for instance, the goal about prosperous Wales is about being an innovative, productive and low carbon society, but one that recognises the limits of global environment and therefore uses resources efficiently. And the resilient the resilient Wales goal it is about the environment, but it's also about how you might use natural resources of the country to support social economic resilience and to allow the capacity to adapt to climate change. So it's, there's deliberate links between the different goals built in. And in terms of the UN Sustainable Development Goal views about leaving no one behind, we have a more equal Wales goal, which tries to cover that and thinks about the potential for all citizens across Wales, no matter what their background circumstances are. So just a quick indication of the way in which statisticians were involved in this. So clearly, I've mentioned that the Act required ministers to set national indicators to measure progress towards the goals, set milestones to show expectations of what the indicators should show at certain points in the future, and to publish an annual progress report setting out the progress. There was actually quite a lot of detail written into the Act about what an indicator should be and how you might measure it. But I'll leave that out at the moment because of time. So, but this is where the statisticians came in, and we ran a series of working groups in order to actually think through how do we best set national indicators. This work was going on in about 2016. We ran a consultation. Here it's explained how do you measure a nation's progress, and we thought through what we meant by national indicators. We wanted it to be a limited number of indicators. So 270 or however many there are is really hard to focus on when you provide that amount of data, if you've got that amount of data to fill those numbers of indicators. So we wanted it to be a limited number. We wanted them to be coherent and fit together. We wanted them to cover the breadth of the goals, but not be specific to an individual goal. So we didn't want people in a health service, for instance, to just look at 4 or 5 indicators that were related to health. We wanted them to think that they could have an impact on some of the other indicators as well, such as employment, for instance, or whatever. And we wanted them to resonate with the public, and that's where we used some of the work from the earlier consultation in the national conversation. So, and we were clear that it had to be something that where it might be possible to show significant progress over the longer term. So they didn't have to be things where it was going to make a difference in a year, but it might be in 5 or 10 years because of that long-term view that we were looking at. And very clearly, I guess I'm going right back up to the top there, it was about outcomes for Wales and not about performance. So we were really clear that it wasn't about measuring local authorities' performance against things. We've had loads of indicators on that in the past. This was not about that. This was about what difference would people working together make to the outcomes for Wales. And then there was a number of other challenges about whether you do something which is subjective rather than objective. So do we measure numbers of crimes in an area, or do we measure whether people feel safe in their area? And quite a few of the indicators are actually subjective indicators about how people feel and in their communities, or whether they have an impact. I've talked about them being integrated, and the involvement and collaboration was about actually working with public services, but also voluntary services and a wide variety of people in order to create the indicators.
We've got about 3 or 4 minutes, please. So,
hey, so I'll just whiz through some of the indicators. This is the way we presented them to make sure that what we're saying is, for instance, on number 12, renewable energy, we're talking about renewable energy. Does it fit with a number of the different goals rather than just one goal? We did that on a variety. We ended up with 46 national indicators. And we've done some recent reviews of that, which actually has made it given us an indication that you know, most people actually feel quite good about that. We are presenting them on a regular basis in a wellbeing report, where we're really quite clearly trying to give an indication. It's like a state of the nation report kind of thing. We're trying to write a report which tells a story, but provides a variety of different ways to get into that data. So there's a full set of data available. There's a slideshow with key messages. There's a narrative about each of those wellbeing goals. And let me just whiz through. Here's the report. We did one specifically on children's wellbeing, and we have an aim to try and do some more bespoke reports as we move through. We present interactive interactive websites with the latest data, but also a chance to sort of look through. I know this is a really detailed report, but for instance, the top one is about relative income poverty. There's one about percentage of people who speak in Welsh, and again, something about renewable energy. So there's 46 of these that enable you to go in and actually have a look at where we're going and look at particular detailed breakdowns of data. So, and we present again in the way that that links it through to the Sustainable Development Goals. So just very quickly then on setting national milestones, this is work which is currently ongoing, and in fact was subject to an RSS local session last year when we were thinking about how do you set national milestones on the basis of the indicators that we have agreed. And we had to talk about the challenges that there might be, trying to make clear that they're not actually targets. There was, you know, you may want to put a specific target on, we want this number to be this at this point in time, but actually that's not often what you would want to do. You may want to say things like employability or employment rates might differ because of the situation that you might be in. So for instance, COVID-19 or, you know, an economic depression or something. So what you might want to do is set a milestone, which is how does Wales fare compared to the rest of the UK, for instance. So we've done quite a lot of thinking about that. How do you set a milestone on a subjective measure, like what proportion of the population are lonely? You know, where would you actually want to put that? And how do you go about doing that? And then some of the indicators we have only really got data for a year or two. So how do you set in milestones when you've actually got a lack of a time series? So we've been very clear actually that we only really want to do this to focus attention on a few of the indicators. So, and onto my concluding thoughts, you'd be pleased to know. So, but the whole process of this, going back through the history, has meant that we've really got buy-in and general positivity to the approach and to the end products of what it is that we're providing for people. And, you know, that's really engaged people and engaged those policy teams as well that are actually making decisions. People look at and understand what we're saying about the state of the nation. And that's been really positive. And the national indicators themselves really seem to have a status. So they're seen as important. People consider that if something isn't a national indicator, then, you know, it's not so much of a priority. And we've been able to use some of those indicators to sort of drive the change that that people are wanting to see across Wales. So there are developments in policy documents that actually use some of those indicators to push things forward on fair work and gender equality and employability. So, but there remain some challenges. Do they really truly help us make difficult decisions? The indicators obviously are only part of the story, and there's lots of research that might be needed, and particularly in terms of understanding what are the elements that might make a difference to those indicators. We've still got to make sure that the story is being heard. And as everyone else has mentioned, how can we better understand inequalities? So there's been lots of work on that, and we still need to sort of push on providing more better data on intersectionality and that kind of thing. And impact of the pandemic, we're very conscious that we don't know quite how well those indicators are going to reflect what the changes have been because of the pandemic. Is it actually picking up concerns over people's own health and, you know, public transport safety and things like that? We've done a quick look at what might go up, what might go down on the back of, you know, the COVID pandemic. So, you know, air quality and volunteering might be improved, but there will be lots of other things which might not. So that's really all I wanted to do, to just give you an understanding of where we are in Wales and how we've built the statistical thinking into all the work that's going on, that's embedding future generations' work into policies. Thank you.
Diolch yn fawr, Sue. Thank you very much. We now go straight to our fourth speaker, Matthew Powell. Matthew, unfortunately, we're not going to be able to see Matthew this afternoon, but believe me, he is there and he's ready to talk about what's going on in Myanmar. Matthew.
My talk is in some ways going to be similar to Sue's, but we're in Myanmar is at a much earlier phase. So I'm particularly interested in thinking about maybe the lessons we can learn from people like Wales, and also think about perhaps what the Myanmar experience can say about the challenges which are going to be faced in other developing countries as well, as we try and move towards incorporating the data from and the indicators like the SDG indicator systems into national policy. And so what I'm actually going to talk about is the indicators, not for SDGs as SDGs, but the indicators for the Myanmar Sustainable Development Plan. Okay. So what this was a plan which was launched in 2018, and it's supposed to provide, by the present government, and is supposed to provide the long-term vision for the country. And it was aligned with the other commitments and policy documents which have been developed for the country, including the SDGs themselves. There's a 12-point economic policy, and there are various regional international commitments to do with human rights and the environment and in many other areas. And so the plan has 3 pillars. There are 5 goals, which you can see listed here. Under the goals, there are 28 strategies and some 251 action plans. So I can see you smiling. I think you must have been through this thing before. And on top of the plan, at the same time as the plan was developed, it was a very high level policy discussions, but they did think, they thought, if we have a plan, we need indicators. So they said we need a national indicator framework, and this was a coherent and consistent government-wide M&E framework. So I was supposed to have 2 parts. One was this national indicator framework with indicators, baselines, targets, and metadata. Again, I'm quoting here from the plan document. And also set of institutional arrangements. Okay, and which is very important because Myanmar is a country which has only a very limited tradition of using data to direct policy or plans in any way. So this is very, it's a new thing, both at the center of government level and to a certain extent at the ministries and departments level as well. So it's quite a, it's a new way of working for the country and a new way of thinking. And the Central Statistics Office is responsible for this national indicator framework. And the UNDP is assisting in its development. So that the beginning of the work, the beginning of the development, it started in back in 2018, and it was a whole process of consultations and meetings with ministries and departments and agencies, some of the NGO community, and the NGO community, and also the development partners as well, about around going on a sort of a goal by goal and a strategy by strategy basis. So there were working groups and task forces for each goal and strategy. And but that was very much, and that came up with some 286 indicators, of which 41%, 117 were SDG indicators. So actually this framework covers quite a large chunk of the SDG indicators. Yeah. And most of the indicators are at the strategic level. So in theory, we're supposed to be looking at outcomes here. But those indicator discussions, that year of consultations, a lot of it was around what should we measure? What should we be measuring for these things? So we have another phase, which is when the statisticians got more involved, which has started in August last year. Hang on, am I going down? Yeah, which we call the metadata process, the National Indicator Framework. And that's another 3 rounds of consultations. And instead of being organized by, so that the idea, I think originally when this was first thought of, was that indicators need metadata, and that's simple enough. But of course, that's not simple. But here there are a couple of extra other issues. One is that a lot of the previous discussions hadn't necessarily involved people who actually generated data or worked with data a lot. So that meant that there was a lot of work, a lot of refinement of the indicators, quite a lot of refinement, just as soon as they came up against people who could actually think, what does it mean that this thing is measurable or not? Another was that perhaps even more important actually than what we normally think of as, and more fundamental than what we normally think of as the metadata work and the collection of metadata, was the negotiation of responsibilities. We actually had to decide and get people to agree that they were going to be responsible for delivering these indicators. And which I'm not sure whether it's a cultural thing or whether it is but people were very reluctant to accept responsibility for actually delivering indicators. And another thing which quickly became apparent is that one of the most important things we're going to have to do, one of the most important sorts of metadata we're going to have to collect, is about not just about what this indicator is, how are we going to measure, how recording information about existing systems. One of the most important sorts of information we're trying to record was information about developing plans for developing these things in the future, because not all these indicators can be measured. And even where they can be measured, we can't just automatically assume that this indicator is going to go on being measured and is going to stay the same and is going to be what can I say? And is automatically going to appear. And that's especially the case in a country like Myanmar, where there are indicators which are heavily dependent on surveys which are funded by donors of one sort or another. So especially we're talking about the Demographic and Health Survey, the Multiple Indicator Cluster Survey, the Living Standards Measurement Survey. So there are these big international survey programs, but the funding for and the arrangements for any given country are always subject to a little bit of uncertainty. And so it's even where there is an indicator up and running, a survey that can be used, we have to let people know what is actually going to be, what's required, what is going to be required, what's going to be necessary to produce this data in the future. So I was asked to say something about the effects of COVID-19 on this process, because COVID-19, of course, has come across this process. We had our third meeting on this metadata work they happened in March this year, and COVID-19 was cutting right across it. So in terms of direct effects on Myanmar from COVID-19, there's a surge at the moment, but so far it's been relatively mild, only 8 deaths. There's been a partial shutdown and range of welfare measures taken by the government, mainly by the government, but there's also been a lot of funding from donors as well. And the projections on economic growth, because Myanmar had been growing fairly fast, poverty had been falling quite quickly, and of course that's that progress has all been set back quite a long way. And COVID, of course, has also had effects on the statistical system. There's been some suspension of data collections. Interestingly, the CPI is still being collected in markets. It was reckoned that was too important to drop. On the data collection side, there have been new telephone surveys associated with was for official statistics in Myanmar. This is new technology. I haven't been doing telephone interviewing before, so this is like something they were thinking about doing in the future sometime, and now they have to do it now. And so that's involved making links with the market research community, sometimes buying in expertise. The donors have driven this quite a lot. So the World Bank is setting up, has set up household surveys which are connected to the Central Statistics Office, and there's consultation, but you couldn't really say the CSO is driving them. UNDP is also doing some work on enterprise surveys and looking at particular vulnerable groups for survey work, and that's much more closely connected with CSO, in that we're trying to get CSO staff involved in more directly in the data collection there. There's new reporting mechanisms. Both the Ministry of Health and Sport has setting up dashboards for just tracking the COVID situation and reporting, having sort of daily tracking of this is the first time that the government has had daily tracking of anything that you can produce. So that's on their website. So that is the public daily tracking of anything.
Matthew, just
yes.
a couple more minutes, please. Thanks.
Okay, I'll go faster. CSO, and the CSO is doing work on dashboard as well. There's been analysis work, and there are normal difficulties about doing more work over Zoom. The sort of issues which I'd like to raise for discussion here about, well, where do we go now? That's where we left it. How can these indicators actually come to affect anything? And so we start off with thinking about, well, how does policy actually, what is government policy in Myanmar? And looking at the processes and the thinking actually, and well, drawing, I'm not just the statisticians here, drawing on a lot of work which has been done on governance in the country, and thinking about targeting, and they did, and sorry, who do we want to get to? And it seems that the only real policy process is there's an annual budgeting process, and there's an annual planning process, which is really just a development budget. And so anything which is going to affect what the government does has to fit into that cycle. And so that, which in turn means that we've got to do annual reports. With it, that we need to report on two things, have a sort of twin track thing. One is what's actually happening. We have to have one set of reports on what's actually happening, and those will have to go up through the planning and through a cabinet committee called the MSDP implementation unit. And the other is on the system, the indicator system. We need to track the indicator system itself, and that's a separate thing, a separate reporting line. So, and again, there's another committee. There's another cabinet committee, the Central Committee on Data Quality and Statistics, which our attempt is, we want to say, okay, you, the cabinet has signed this off, this framework, saying yes, we want these information, we want these indicators. We now need to tell them, well, these are the indicators which we can produce. If you want to even keep these indicators, let alone maintain them, we'll need resources, we will need authorization. This is what is going to be required. So we need to so that we need those two tracks. What's going on? What's happening with the indicator system? The use of trends is very important, because the big annual reporting, of course, many of these things are not measured annually. And so the periodicity of many things is, and there is irregular. You come from all different sorts of measurement systems. They don't all report at the same time or on the same schedule. Many surveys don't happen, maybe happen every 3 years, every 5 years, censuses every year. So the way we've suggested to get around this is the use of trends, by fitting trends. Now, at the moment, and so what we want to focus on is, what does the data we've got, if we fit a simple trend to it, what is that going to tell us about where we're going to be in 2030, which is the end of the plan? And that's the way of trying to standardize across the different indicators. Another issue is about aggregation across the indicators, because no way is anybody going to wade through all these indicators. Some of them, there are some things which are positive for one part of they may promote jobs, but they damage the environment. So there are some indicators which nobody at the moment can understand. It would be confusing at the moment to try to prepare some sort of index. So our solution at the moment is just that we prepare summaries. So for the indicators for each goal, to say of the indicators for the goal, which ones are on track to meet a known target or known objective. That's mainly the SDGs have at least international objectives, if not official Myanmar objectives yet. And mostly about which indicators are going in the right direction, in the wrong direction, which indicators can't we tell either way, either because the movement doesn't appear to us to be statistically significant, or because the data is ropey, or because we and which have no data at all. And just try, and that's the simplest aggregation we could think of. And based on that, the planning department is supposed to produce narrative summaries just to say, okay, if for this area, these are the important points you need to think about. And that's where they need to dive into the database to learn more about what's going on.
Could you start winding up, please, Matthew?
I am winding up. I'll skip over that to the structure. This is my last slide. So this is where we are at the moment, because this is the first year in which we're going to try to report on this. It turns out that the process hasn't been totally disrupted by COVID crisis. The systems are still running. They're still churning out data. People are still responding to emails. So you notice the indicators, there are more indicators now. I talked about 270, but if you looked at those previous indicators, you could see that some of them were like you would have air, sea, and road passengers. Different systems, different definitions, different organizations involved in them completely, and so it makes sense to think of them as different indicators for metadata and reporting and control purposes. So now we have 380 indicators after those splits. So we've received 166 of them with data. You received that's 44 where we've got more added metadata, but no actual data yet, and 170 not received. So we have within each goal, and actually within each strategy, we have some indicator on the which it may be possible to say something about what's happening, and that's our aim for this cycle, to be able to say, to get those numbers somehow injected into the budget discussions for the recurrent and development budget, and say how so that those allocation decisions will move towards keeping the plan on track. So that's our aim, and so that's. So there are a whole, I'm not sure how much of that sounds familiar to you all here, but I would certainly be interested to hear about how you can, whether you have any ideas for how to address these issues that we're coming up against. So thank you very much.
I think Matthew's point at the end is extremely interesting, in the sense that, okay, we have now the indicators pointing that things are going in a certain way. Is anyone going to react to that? Is anyone going to do anything about whatever it is that's being measured or indicated? Johannes, do you think yourself that the SDGs will have an impact on policy?
Well, I mean, that's an interesting question anyway, that we have currently also on a broader level. I mean, will evidence and science lead to policy change? I mean, this is a critical question, and we see that in many countries. Look at the COVID response. I mean, some countries follow scientific advice and some other countries not. And some countries are driven, and this you can go to the local government. You can, I mean, it's not just the national government. So what I can say from the countries we are following, I think surprisingly many, to some extent surprisingly, many classical, we would call them still developing countries, are following the SDG agenda quite seriously. And even in areas where you would think it's not necessarily comes to your mind that those countries, for instance, gender equality is on a very high agenda in many countries where you wouldn't necessarily think that the regime would support this. And they are pushing, and even the statistical office is mandated. So governance statistics in Africa, look at how many African statistics are now developing serious governance measurement frameworks, also driven partly through SDGs. So I think the SDGs are taken seriously by many. There are lots of technical challenges, and I think the examples were very interesting from rich to not so rich countries. This turning into policy depends on capacities also of decision makers and the willingness to do it. And that, is often very context specific. But overall, I would say in certain areas, certainly the SDGs have been already driving policy change for often also for the better. That would be my view.
Thank you. We've had quite a few questions coming from Milan Joshi. He wonders whether the SDG goals should be revised and made more flexible. I'm not sure at this stage they can be actually revised, Milan. But he also asks, do you engage psychologists to design questionnaires to elicit subjective things like anxiety or satisfaction? Sue, do you want to have a go at that one?
Okay, so I would say that we probably don't engage psychologists, but we might be thinking about behavioral science, I guess, in some areas, but we would also be trying to understand specifically the best way to answer, to encourage people to answer questions and the right ways in asking those sorts of questions. And there will be times when we have taken very specific work that has already been undertaken, such as about mental health scores and things like that of the public. So that will have been work that will have undertaken, been working with psychologists, as I understand it.
So. And a quick one for Fiona, specifically from Alison McFarlane. How many of the SDG indicators are compiled on a UK basis, and how many for each of the 4 nations separately?
Oh, I can't answer that off the top of my head, I'm afraid. Where we can, we use UK data and report for the UK. I can't give you the numbers, I'm afraid, off the top of my head. But obviously, with the 4 nations with devolved responsibilities for different aspects, so for health in particular, it's not always possible to be able to create data that is UK relevant, because the policies and the way the data has been collected is often different. So there are issues there about whether or not we can always report for the UK, but where possible, we would be able to point out to where you could find that data for all 4 nations.
Okay, thanks, Fiona. Jalal, while you're still on, Fiona, Jalal Almajed has said that on your Open SDG world map, he can see the Jordan flag, but he can't see Jordan's name on the list. So perhaps you should check that.
That's because we're still talking to Jordan, and they're very interested in the Open SDG. So perhaps we were a bit premature putting their flag on. I'll take that back. So apologies for that.
Thank you for that clarification. And a question to Matthew. Could you give us an example of metadata in Myanmar?
I can perhaps talk about it more.
Not too long, Matthew.
Okay, yeah. Rather than read through one example, because it's quite long. So for each of the indicators, so the 380 indicators, we have it's a 6-page form which is filled in, and you've got to contain details on all the sorts of normal areas. You would have metadata for starting around who is going to deliver it, how do you get it, is it public, is it what does it look like when you get it, what is the what's the what's the source, and if it's a survey, then the details about the sample size and issues like that. If it's administrative data, you're looking at the original purpose of the administrative data. But for our exercise, I said there are these extra elements where we have a section where because we are these indicators, the responsibility of these indicators actually lies with a lot of line ministries. They're not just experts on the statistics, they're experts on the subject. So we're asking them to give us information about justification, that why is this number interesting for this policy, and to say, and asking them to tell us, should it go up or go down? Because you may not believe it, but actually in the earlier discussions, some people had actually produced indicators without thinking about whether they really wanted them to go up or down. And if there is a target, what is there to tell us about the target? And so there's that sort of information, and then also the information about the plans and information about other data in the same area. Okay, because many of these, so it's a whole range of standard data. Because, sorry, I would say about the other data in the same area, because often you'll see information published by lots of different sources on the same number. Things like population, you will see the UN population figures and national population figures.
Okay,
they're different.
Right. Okay, thanks, Matthew.
Yeah.
And I think the final question from Ian Plewis, we'd better go to Fiona, I think. Disaggregation is important, but there's a danger that the unmeasured noise overwhelms the signal, as you alluded to. How can statistical uncertainty be incorporated to reporting the indicators?
Yes, and I think that's something we have to be very careful about, and we need to make sure that we're presenting the data, that the data we're presenting is accurate, and we can understand the quality of the data, and we can understand what that noise might be. And I think therefore being able to look not just within, so this is where, by being able to look across the intersectionality as well as looking inwards, helps with that, because you get a much rounder picture. So I think, we need to weigh up getting breadth as well as depth, and also obviously understanding the quality of the data that we're getting, and how to interpret that, and making sure that we're being open and transparent about that to our users so they can understand what the data is telling them.
Thank you very much. And thank you to all our speakers. Our time has run out. We mustn't bump into the next session, who are presumably waiting in the green room. So thank you all very much for your talks today, and goodbye.